certainty. Even if they could afford to, no one wanted to bid on the seized items, and the auction raised next to nothing. To make matters worse, the two men who made out best in the auctions were Vinius and Icelus, who picked up all manner of property for pennies on the dollar. This only reinforced the idea that the whole operation had been masterminded by Galba's fiendish advisors, who control the senile old fool completely, don't you know, to make themselves rich at everyone else's expense. The whole thing was a public relations nightmare, but Galba either didn't understand how much ill will he was stirring up, or he simply didn't care. The topper to all this was that while the new imperial administration was running around seizing everyone's property and auctioning it off to itself, Galba was announcing that there was not enough money to restore the free grain allotments that had been suspended by Nero following the Great Fire. The shuttering of the grain allotments had been a grievance the poor had been nursing for the last few years, and with Nero now gone, they fully expected Galba to get the grain flowing again, the new emperor virtually friendless. The upper and middle classes hated him for arbitrarily seizing their illegally obtained property, while the lower classes hated him for denying the free grain allotment. Having already alienated most of the legions with his heavy-handed discipline, especially the legions on the Rhine, which we'll cover in greater detail next week, Galba was fast running out of allies. But at least he still had the Praetorians on his side. As long as an emperor has that final line of protection, there is little anyone can do to stop him from doing whatever he wants. Oh, what's that you say? The Praetorians were actually among the first to get super ticked off at Galba? Well, I guess he's in real trouble then, huh? The problem with the Praetorians, as I mentioned, was that earlier in the year, Nymphidius Sabinus had promised them a huge payout if they abandoned Nero and backed Galba. But of course, Galba had never authorized such a promise, and never in a million years would have paid what was, in effect, a massive bribe. As I said in episode 68, Galba believed in the chain of command almost to a fault. A commander did not purchase the loyalty of his troops. He commanded, and they obeyed. Period. But even discarding the specific promises made by Sabinus, Galba's decision not to pay out a donative to the Praetorians upon his ascension broke with an accepted practice that dated back to Tiberius. It was considered a goodwill gesture to get the new administration off on the right foot. Galba, though, not only refused to pay the sum promised by Sabinus, but he refused to pay any sum at all. The Praetorians were incensed at being denied what they considered to be their rightful payout. But Galba refused to reconsider his position. That may have been the way the Julio-Claudians operated, but the Julio-Claudians were dead and gone. Galba was intent on founding a new dynasty, one based on honor and duty, not crass self-interest and purchased loyalty. Which brings us to the last decision Galba would make as emperor. One old man does not a dynasty make. From the moment the childless Galba had been declared Caesar, the question on everybody's mind was who he would choose to be his heir and successor. Every semi-influential man of senatorial rank believed that he deserved the prize, but one man, above all the others, was really super convinced that he was going to get the nod. Marcus Salvius Otho. Having supported Galba from the beginning, and having accompanied the new emperor on his march to Rome, Otho was already making plans for what he would do once he became emperor. As I mentioned a few episodes ago, adding to Otho's confidence was a recently taken astrological forecast that basically said, Galba will soon be dead, and you will succeed him. Plus, on a less abstract level, Otho had made a deal with Vinius that locked the influential advisor into backing Otho's bid in exchange for Otho marrying Vinius' sister once the adoption went through. But as 68 became 69 AD, Galba still had not made up his mind. Reports started coming in that there was some unrest within the legions on the Rhine, and that possibly they were in full revolt. Probably nothing to worry about. The same thing had happened when Tiberius had ascended to the throne. All Tiberius had to do was send his son out to talk some sense into them, so maybe Galba should just, oh wait, the old man still hasn't chosen a successor yet. Galba had been taking his time with the decision to make sure he got it right. Or, possibly, because with everything else that was going on, he simply didn't have the time or energy to focus on the issue of succession. But when word came that the legions on the Rhine were in full mutiny, Galba decided that he needed to reassure the empire that the center of power was and would remain in Rome, not in the legionary camps on the Rhine. Behind closed doors, he met with his advisors. Vinius, of course, argued in favor of Otho, while Icelius and Laco backed a man named Cornelius Dorabella. But this seems to be one of the few occasions that Galba acted on his own, and dissatisfied with both candidates, he announced that he would be adopting a man named Lucius Calpurnius Piso, a man of impeccable breeding who had spent the majority of Nero's reign in exile and had only recently been recalled to Rome. Piso was brought into the meeting and informed that he was now officially the heir of Galba. The three pedagogues were shocked and annoyed when Piso took the announcement in calm stride. Clearly, Piso was not himself a power-hungry man, and they didn't much like the idea of having to serve someone who lacked the kind of avarice and ambition they could really exploit. Bad for business, you know? When Galba made his decision public, it is important to note that he did not make his speech to the Senate or to a mass gathering of the people, but rather to a hastily called meeting of the Praetorian Guard. Galba apparently thought that this deference to the Guard would make up for the missing donative that he had never paid. But the short speech introducing Piso, which Galba gave on January 10, went over like a lead balloon. There was still no word on the missing bonus, which the Guard had not forgotten, and, adding insult to injury, there was no talk of the additional bonus which usually accompanied births, weddings, adoptions, and other happy occasions. On top of all that, Otho had been making the rounds within the Praetorians for months, gaining their trust and confidence by dispersing huge sums of cash and hinting that there would be more where that came from once he finally became the heir apparent. So everyone was expecting generous and charismatic Otho, and what they got was a humorless exile who seemed no more inclined to buy their love than Galba. Needless to say, the cheers greeting the arrival of Piso were less than enthusiastic. When Otho found out he had been passed over, he was livid. So livid, in fact, that he quickly gave himself over to a murderous rage that came boiling up to the surface. He was embarrassed and he was angry. But more than that, he was deeply in debt, and had been borrowing heavily against the understanding that he would soon be Galba's heir, and eventually emperor in his own right. The minute Otho found out he was not going to be the heir, was the minute Otho realized that his many, many creditors would soon be beating down his door. Otho himself is reported to have joked darkly that unless he became emperor, it would not matter whether he was found by his enemies on the battlefield or found by his creditors in the forum. The result would be the same. His life passing before his eyes, Otho turned to extreme measures and immediately began plotting to assassinate both Galba. With the last few dollars he could scrape together, Otho purchased the service of 23 Praetorian guardsmen. Tacitus mentions that had Galba even given a perfunctory sum to the guard upon his ascension, it is unlikely that any of them would have turned so readily, but that ship had now sailed. Otho came with money and promises, whereas Galba had shown himself disdainful of both. Knowing that they had to act fast to avoid discovery, the conspirators were ready to go on January 15, just 5 days after the introduction of Piso. That morning, Otho, along with the rest of the Senate, paid their respects to Galba at a religious ceremony held at the Temple of Apollo, adjacent to the imperial palace. At the arranged hour, an accomplice fetched Otho from the proceedings with the cover story that a realtor needed to talk to him about a potential home sale. Otho left the ceremony and hurried to meet his accomplices in the forum. With the rest of the ruling class occupied with Galba's ceremony, Otho rushed the Praetorian camp. The conspirators pushed their way past the camp gatekeeper and called for the Praetorians to muster so Otho could address them. The officers were wary of what was unfolding, but the common soldiers were eager to hear what Otho had to say. Playing up their every grievance, Otho reminded them of the disrespect Galba had repeatedly shown, not just to them, but to every common soldier he'd ever led. Otho assured his audience that all the provincial legions hated Galba, and that the Senate and people of Rome both would gladly be rid of the mean old man if only someone would act in their name. There was no time to waste, Otho cried. They must now, right now, strike a blow for the empire. Having worked the soldiers into a frenzied mix of self-interest and grand idealism, Otho ordered a cohort of cavalry out of the camp to find the hated Galba and kill him. Meanwhile, the morning ceremony had wrapped up, and Galba was getting down to the day's business, when frantic word came of what was happening in the Praetorian camp. Confusion reigned as rumor after counter-rumor poured into the palace. At one point, a soldier arrived and, lying through his teeth for whatever reason, announced that he had taken care of the situation by personally killing Otho. At this, Galba displayed his customary disdain for individual initiative. Rather than congratulating the soldier, Galba asked harshly who had ordered him to kill Otho. Unsure, though, now of whether Otho was dead or alive, a heated debate between Galba's advisors ensued on whether to lock down the palace and hole up, or ride out to meet this treasonous challenge to imperial authority. Galba finally settled on the latter course. Donning a breastplate, he climbed in his imperial litter and was carried out into the forum, accompanied by a collection of bodyguards, the 3 pedagogues, and his adopted son Piso. Before he could make it to the Praetorian camp, though, Galba was met by the charging cavalrymen. No one knew how dire the situation really was until the cavalry ignored all calls to halt and simply charged headlong into Galba's party. The litter was knocked to the ground, and before Galba could rise, he was stabbed to death. Laco and Icelus managed to flee, but Vinius was caught and killed, despite his protests, possibly indicating his complicity in the plot, that Otho had not ordered his death. Piso also managed to flee the scene, but was cornered in the Temple of the Vestas and killed. The heads of both Galba and Piso were delivered to Otho, who allowed them to be kicked around for sport by the soldiers now under his command. Galba was murdered at the age of 70, having served as emperor for just over 7 months, by far the shortest tenure in office since the inception of the Principate. It was a record, however, that would not last long. Otho, who would accept the title of both Caesar and Augustus after they were foisted upon him by the Praetorians and then confirmed by the Senate within hours of the coup, would wind up wearing the purple for half that long. On April 15, just 3 months after taking office, Otho would commit suicide in his tent after being defeated by Vitellius's invading Rhine legions. Next week, we will get into how Vitellius, one of the most unlikely candidates for emperor in Roman history, found himself leading the Western Empire in revolt, and what Otho did in the few months he reigned to try to stamp it out. I will close this week by extending my deep appreciation for all the donations that have come in over the last few weeks. You guys are amazing. The now Mrs. History of Rome and I are blown away by your generosity, so thank you very, very much. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you are now fully aware, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend picking up